Hello and welcome to my KLR 250 YouTube content channel. Today we're going to be talking all about the KLR 250. When I was doing research into the KLR 250, I just wasn't able to find out a whole lot of information in one oracle or specific location, so I had to kind of go all over and get little bits and pieces and piecemeal it all together. So what I'm going to try to do here for the rest of the KLR 250 community is consolidate that and hopefully not go too long-winded with it, but I'm sure I will. So let's get started. The predecessor of the KLR 250 was the 1978 Kawasaki KL 250. That was their first four-stroke dual-sport motorcycle. Had a 21-inch front tire and a 17-inch rear, which shared with the KLR 250, and that's about the only thing. It had a single overhead cam, air-cooled 250cc engine, 249, and a 5-speed transmission. It was a dual rear shock motorcycle, all analog. I believe it did have I do believe it had a CDI ignition. I don't believe it had points. I actually owned one. I owned a KL 250 as a beater bike, and I literally rode the fenders off it, and it still just kept going. I actually sold it for more than I paid for it, and I owned it for probably like 4 years. However, that bike was very short-lived. It was introduced in 1978, and it was dismissed in 1979. So that's a lot of effort to put into a R&D of a motorcycle that only ran for 2 years. Why that was, I don't know. Did it not sell well? Did it not compare well to a bunch of the two-stroke dual-sport bikes that were available? I just don't know. So Kawasaki didn't have anything in that market segment until the introduction of the KLR 250. And the two bikes are very, very different as far as technology goes, setup and everything. This KLR 250 was a complete blank sheet redesign, which seems kind of odd that after abandoning the segment after 2 years, Kawasaki would put all that R&D into something very high tech for the time. And they launched the KLR 250, from what I can see, in 1984, although I don't think any models made it to the United States until maybe 1986. I've seen some 85s running around. Most of those claim that they're import bikes. So the original models were probably introduced in Japan and maybe Asia and maybe Europe. It took a little while for it to get to the United States. My manual that I have is actually from Kawasaki, the service manual supplemental, and it claims to cover model years 1985 to 1989. So what makes the KLR 250 so unique in the 250cc dual sport, street legal dual sport class, is that it was very high tech for its day. It is class leading in all of its contemporaries and even among all of its modern predecessors that you can buy today. The KLR 250 ran from 1984 or 1983, depending on when it first dropped, up to its discontinuation date in 2005, almost unchanged during the entire production run. There were some changes, and we'll talk about that in a little bit. So what makes the KLR 250 so unique in the four-stroke 250 class? Technology. It was and is a sub 300-pound wet dual sport motorcycle with 28 horsepower. The initial early models, Kawasaki claimed they were 200, or not 200 yet, it'd be awesome, 28 horsepower. Later models, after the revised cams, were said to be 25 horsepower. Later models, 23 horsepower with revised jetting. It was a four-stroke, single-cylinder, dual overhead cam, 4-valve motorcycle with a 6-speed transmission and a high-compression 11.1 counterbalanced 4-stroke engine. Liquid-cooled, 6-speed transmission, 28 horsepower, sub 300. Wet weight motorcycle. Nothing else in the class at the time, and almost nothing currently can match any of those specs. Why did Kawasaki produce that? Why did they go through all the trouble? It's very speculative. I think there might be two main reasons. I think the eminent banning of two-stroke street bikes and also of three-wheelers in the United States was in the air in 1983, 1984, 1985, and ultimately 1985 and 1986, three-wheelers were banned in the United States, and two-stroke motorcycles over 50 cc's were also banned. Maybe Kawasaki saw that coming and thought they could get a jump on the high-performance four-stroke motorcycles. Maybe they thought two-stroke dirt bikes were going to be banned as well, and they would have the absolute leader in that field. Had the industry had to go to four-stroke, they would have been 100% had the motor in the box ready to go. Why does the three-wheeler thing matter? Because when the three-wheelers were banned, everybody just made two-wheeled front ends for their trikes and started selling them as four-wheelers. Well, Kawasaki used the same engine at the same time, most part the same engine, the 250cc. It's a 249cc engine in their Mojave four-wheeler, which had pretty good success and actually ended up being raced when the three-wheelers were ultimately banned. So that is a possible reason to put all that money in there. It's also possible that they were competing for government contracts. The KLR 250 did see service with many militaries and police forces. That might have been one of their initial best-selling models. They might have sold, I don't have the numbers to back that up, but I think maybe that's why they pulled the plug on the KL 250. Maybe it just wasn't high enough performance or enough technology to impress anyone to buy it. The KLR 250 certainly did impress. It saw service with many militaries and police forces, including the United States Marines. I believe that was used as the M1030, and it was later replaced by the KLR 650s that were modified to run off diesel. So those are my two speculations on what enticed them to spend so much money in basically what's a low dollar, low sales niche, being the 250cc dual sport class. It doesn't really make a whole lot of sense, but who cares? It's a great bike. There were problems with early models, and two of the main changes that were made between the early models and the later models, about 1988, or maybe it was actually 89, they revised the cams for lower lift because they were having top-end failures. And we'll talk about that a little later on. So they changed the cam profile, and that supposedly dropped the engine from 28 horsepower to 25. That's not a bad compromise if it keeps the bike together. And they also changed the foot pegs for the passenger arrangement. On the early models, those foot pegs were ridiculously mounted on the rear swing arm, about the midway point. So obviously, as the suspension moved, so did the passenger's leg, which I'm sure was unnerving, uncomfortable, and just kind of weird. So they did solve that pretty elegantly by making a bracket that connected to the subframe and also to the main spars of the cradle frame. Very stable, worked out great, much more comfortable and less alarming for the passenger. It did move that foot peg position a little further forward, which again was also more comfortable. The rear mounted area halfway back on the swing arm was really had the passenger's knees bent back pretty far, so that was a much welcome improvement. Other than that, the bike stayed pretty much unchanged through its entire production run. There were additions of what we know as bold new colors, including the very oddly colored Barbie bike which has actually become desirable, as often happens because of its uniqueness with its bright blue plastic, yellow, purple, and actually one of the, as far as I know, only KLR 250s that had a frame painted a different color than silver, other than the military bikes that were black. The Barbie bike's frame was purple. It's not quite for me, but I tell you what, it is starting to grow on me. As a teenager in the late 80s and 90s, it's actually kind of brings back some memories of BMX bicycles with their bold new graphics and whatnot. So anyway, it does a 21-inch front tire with a disc brake, a rear drum brake on a 17-inch wheel. It was replaced or superseded by Kawasaki's KLX 250S, which in the 2006 model year claimed 21 horsepower and 300 pounds wet. So its predecessor, with inverted forks and bold new graphics, plastics, it's a very good bike, by the way, still could not match the power or the weight of the original KLRs, or even the revised and downrated KLRs. State of the art in the day, and even quite competitive today in the dual sport market, with its Unilink rear monoshock suspension, had 9.5 inches of travel front and back, which is unheard of, except for motocross bikes of the day, and about 10.5 inches of ground clearance. Compared to other dual sports of the early, mid, and late 80s, that was just unheard of. So what would have been in the 250cc class market in 1983, or let's just say mid-80s when the KLR dropped, you're talking about XR 200s, which were actually still dual shocks at that time the KLR was released. The later 250s, which were mono shocks. Yamaha's XT 350 is a bit of a stretch. I don't really consider that a 250cc motorcycle. I'm considering 200 to 250cc, but it's still worth noting. The XT 225, which, as most of us know, is still around, is the XT 250. The DR 200S and the DR 350S, again, that's a 350. Those bikes are still around as well, and very good bikes. So actually, as a matter of fact, all those motorcycles are air-cooled. Some of them claim oil air cooling. It's just fins. Maybe there's an oil cooler, maybe there's not. I believe all of those bikes are 5-speed transmissions. So none of them can touch, I don't think any of them, except maybe the XT350, breach 25 horsepower or the top speed of the KLR because of that 6-speed transmission. So obviously some of the pros we've already talked about. This is in its class, hands down, at the time, and even today, for the cost. 28 horsepower at 9,000 RPM, 21 foot-pounds of torque, top speed around 85 miles per hour with the stock gearing. It's easily geared up and has the power to go more with the 6-speed transmission. It's a high-tech, 4-stroke, dual-sport motorcycle. It has a high-compression engine. It's 11.1, which again is unheard of, which required a compression release mechanism. Well, instead of using a manual compression release, it has an automatic one, which I don't know if this was the first instance of that or not. It's actually a centrifugal weighted clutch with a spring that sits on the exhaust cam and cracks when the exhaust cam opens. The bike is kickstart only. I guess we could probably throw that down in the cons, but at the time I really don't think there was anything in the class that was electric start. It kicks very easily if you're a taller rider because of its high seat height and ground clearance. It is a 4-valve dual overhead cam, dual overhead valve liquid-cooled engine. The monoshock unitrack rear suspension. The bike has, even for its age and the bikes today, I think it has very modern looks and chassis. It's the first liquid-cooled monoshock KX250 was introduced in 1983, 1984, and if you put that next to the KLR, it's weird looking and kind of butt ugly. And I'll put some graphics up on the screen there so you can have a look. Now, was the KX250 was their competition, balls to the wall, all stops out, win on Sunday, sell on Monday motorcycle. And the KLR 250, I think, has a more modern, better looking chassis. The ergonomics on the bike are very good. The seat is super comfortable. The handlebars are actually quite nice with a wide adjustment range. The seat is very wide, and I believe my seat is aftermarket, but I'll tell you what, it's spot on as far as the foam firmness goes. There's no passenger or pillion rise in the seat, so a rider can slide forward and backward over the entire length of the seat seamlessly without having to be constrained by that step or bump. The bike has 9.5 to 10 inches of ground clearance, depending on how you spring it. My bike has been resuspended, so it actually, with the stiffer springing, mine actually unloaded has 11.5 inches of ground clearance. The fuel economy is excellent, good for the 250 class. I have gotten over 60 miles per gallon on mine. When I first got it, it was lean. And it was too lean. So I have rejetted it and fattened it up, and now I'm getting between 50 and 55 miles per gallon. Again, that's with a 2.8 gallon gas tank, which is about 0.8 gallons bigger than most everything modern in its class. Most modern 250 and 300 cc dual sport bikes, to keep their weight down, their curb weight, that is, or wet weight, only give you, and there are ergonomics and shape and all that, 2 gallons. 20-year plus production means that their parts should be in good supply. Unfortunately, new parts and aftermarket parts, not so much. Used parts, yes. The bikes can be bought cheap. Most of them need work. They will or do, due to the suspension issues, and I will cover that in the cons. There are great bikes if you can be found salvageable or running at all and in clean shapes. There you can find plenty of fairly low mile ones that are running for under $2,000. People are trying to sell them now for around $2,000 in good running shape with clean title, up to around $2,500 and $3,000. You just can't beat that if you can do some work on it. You can actually get a KLR 250 and kind of do it up as a military vintage bike and be authentic. You can kind of try to convert a non-military one to a military one if you want. It will never be an authentic one, but you could do it and take it to car shows and even military shows, which is pretty cool. There's not a lot of bikes out there that you can say that and be somewhat authentic. It's kickstart and it's carbureted, so there's no sophisticated electronics. The bike will run without a battery. It'll start without a battery just fine. So in some cases you could consider those cons, but in some cases I would consider them pros. The bike has an OEM aluminum skid plate. It has aluminum rims, and it has an aluminum subframe. So these are just some of the reasons this bike this old bike is lighter, or as light as any of its very modern, lightweight contemporaries. The cons: the suspension. The rear, I actually am finding the front workable. You can adjust the front pretty easily with oil, spacers, and springs, fairly inexpensively. The rear shock I think it was pretty much junk, to be quite honest with you, from new. Is not rebuildable because it's welded. It does have clickers on it, only 4. I could never tell 1 iota difference between 1 and 4 on it. It was undersprung and had very low life period. It tended to wipe out the seals because it was always experiencing excessive travel, even if you cranked the preload. It did have adjustable preload ring nuts on it. You could crank that up all you want, and all the thing would do was buck and kick you in the butt after it bottomed. They were junk. Fortunately, there are several aftermarket alternatives that make the bike, as it should have been for the amount of technology that was in it, a much better motorcycle where it can use its travel at high ground clearance. But the rear shock stock is junk. It does have a rear drum brake, a 17-inch rear wheel, which does limit your wheel choices, tire choices, I should say. That said, you can get a full knob for it. There's plenty of 17-inch dual sport bikes out there. It is a narrow 17 inches, which does also further narrow your wheel choices. You cannot really put a much fatter tire on it because you'll be hitting the muffler and the frame and the suspension linkage. The rear brake works fine. The rear drum brake is more than easy to lock up if you overstep on it. That rear drum brake is very well modulated and adjustable, but you do have to adjust it. As those shoes wear, you can do it without tools pretty much, but you have to adjust the screw on the linkage at the back, and after you do that, you need to check the brake light stop switch to make sure it's still activating. Both of those are pretty much adjustable without tools, but they do need to be adjusted. Low interval maintenance schedule. This is a thing. This is a high performance motorcycle, so the manual calls for 500-mile oil changes with a filter and a valve adjustment every 500 miles. That's high maintenance. It is not unheard of in high performance modern 4-stroke engines, but at the time and with dual sport motorcycles, I would say that's high maintenance. You can run better oil and make sure your valves are in adjustment, and you can stretch that out, but I'll get into that later as well. The early 28 horsepower examples had high valve train failures because people didn't do the oil changes and the valve maintenance, because nobody expected you would have to do that on a 250cc dual sport motorcycle, but you did. The detoned cam profiles that lowered the horsepower to 25 did help with that. Did not totally alleviate it. So you still needed to do oil changes, and you still should have done valve checks. Early ones had the passenger arms on the swing arm. Talked about that. There are very few changes over 20-plus years of production, which means you can use pretty much any part off of any year KLR if you need to, new or used. So that's both a pro and a con, I guess. Considering the bike was so high-tech at the time, it really didn't have to be updated. There are very little aftermarket Farkles for it that are specific to the KLR 250. There's plenty of do-it-yourself stuff out there, or you can just use non-bike model specific stuff. So getting hard bags for it that are going to be model specific, easily detachable, buy them off the shelf. You're probably not going to find those. I haven't been able to find any. Most luggage racks are either discontinued or very expensive. But you can use non-model specific stuff like soft bags, and for this bike it's probably a better. You really wouldn't want to go loading this thing up with hard panniers or anything like that. Not that you couldn't, not that it couldn't carry the weight. On the stock suspension, no. Aftermarket suspension, yes. So you can get like tusk bags and stuff like that. Other than that, the aftermarket for it is very, very limited for bike specific things. You're not going to be able to find upgraded brakes unless you use parts off other bikes, and kind of there just isn't aftermarket for this. You're not going to be able to find a wavy front disc rotor or anything like that. There just is, I'm going to say, almost no aftermarket for this bike. There wasn't much when it was in production. It just didn't gain the cult following that the 600s and the 650s did. That said, some stuff off the 600 will fit. Popular rear suspension, a popular inexpensive rear suspension upgrade is to use a KLR 600 or 650 rear shock. There is some modification needed for that, and it ends up lowering the bike, but it does give you a heavier rebuildable shock. Maintenance mean many were abused. So these things were kind of bought as either farm bikes, beginner bikes, even with low mileage, and they were secondhand when people stopped riding them. People started taking the headlight, the turn signals and all that off of them, and just giving them to their kid or whatever, and they just were used as straight up dirt bikes. So a lot of them were bashed, abused, crashed. Bikes were sold and the title was never transferred with it. So that's quite often the case. I see a lot of those bikes end up being parted out because some of the parts are worth more than the bike without a title, especially if the bike needs a lot of work. Low miles does not mean it's a good bike because of the high maintenance schedule. If the bike was not maintained, you could have a bike with 10,000 miles, 12,000 miles, and if you don't if it's running, that's one thing, but if you don't go over it when you get it and you think you're just going to jump on it and ride it, and now you've gone 12,000 miles and no one's ever done a valve adjustment on it, you could be looking at a top end that blows on you, just because it looks good and has low miles. So if you're buying one of these, I would ask the owner, have you ever adjusted the valves? Have you ever looked at the valves? Do you know how to adjust the valves? Do you have any maintenance logs? If the answer to all those is no, the bike still starts easily and sounds okay, I would go for it and then do all that yourself. But if it's blowing smoke, starts hard, or runs rough, and the owner can't answer those questions, I would maybe look somewhere else unless it was really cheap. The bike has mid-80s lighting and 1990s looks. Some people like the looks, and it was modern looks for the day, but now the looks are considered dated. The lighting can be upgraded, and it's something I've done. You can get it's a 4x6 square headlight, and you can get an LED replacement for that. It's brighter, the beam is way wider, and it's lighter. It actually much lighter than the glass halogen bulb. However, you cannot change the bulb in it. You would have, if it for any reason an LED one went out, you would have to replace the whole unit. I think I bought mine. It was actually labeled for TW200, and I bought that for around $30. I don't even know if you can get the halogen replacement bulb for that much. And it's way brighter, way wider beam. And I also did bolt an LED light bar to mine, and I'll tell you what, that thing lights up the world. I also put LED turn signals on mine, so you can certainly update it, or you can just go ahead and go for the vintage look. If you have one of those Barbie bikes, I would say try to keep it original. That might actually be one of the highest dollar, other than the military model, KLR bikes resale, if it's clean and in good shape. The bike is kickstart only, and it's carbureted. We did say that it can be put in both columns of pro and con. So there you have it. That's pretty much all the information I have. I'm already getting long-winded here, but in summation, I just wanted to put up this list of dual sport motorcycles that are in its class. The KLR 250 is not on this list because it's often neglected and ignored. But you can see this list here list the weight of modern, pretty much modern, 250 class dual sports. So it goes all the way from the TW200, great bike, up to the Kawasaki 300 Versus, which is a two-cylinder bike, or the V-Strom, Suzuki V-Strom, and the Kawasaki 300, and the BMW GS310. And you can see in weight, the KLR slides right in at the fourth lightest on the list. And as far as power, if you're going to use the 25 or 28 horsepower, it is almost the second most powerful on the list, which is incredible. So I did run some numbers. I didn't make a graph on it, using the power to weight ratio, and basically the KLR comes in at just over 11 pounds per horsepower. There was only one bike that I ran the numbers on, I think maybe two bikes. One was the BMW GS310, and the only other bike that beat it was, in my opinion, the only other 250 dual sport bike from Japan. I don't. You can go into KTM's all you want. I'm just considering Japanese dual sports 250. Is the venerable Yamaha WR 250R, which unfortunately is now discontinued. They don't make it anymore. So if you can get your hands on one of those, they're fantastic. It's lighter and it makes more power. It has better suspension. I would just say it is nowhere near as comfortable. It is a detuned dirt bike. And by detuned, I mean for reliability, engine-wise. Chassis-wise, it's pretty much a WR 250. Uses the YZ chassis, suspension, all that. So that's something to be said. And Yamaha discontinued that bike. And you would be very hard-pressed to find any of those in decent shape with a title under $4,000. They go pretty regularly for $4,500, $5,000. And now that they don't make them anymore, good luck. So that's something to be said. I think that pretty much sums it up. So there you go. If I got anything wrong, please mention it down in the comments, or you feel I got anything wrong, or anybody has anything to add, subscribe. I don't do a whole lot of content now that I'm pretty much done fixing my KLR up. But I appreciate you anyway, especially if you stayed here to the end. Thank you very much. Be safe and have fun.